Hopper really understood what's in the artist's mind's eye. It's that original way of viewing the world. It's kind of there from the start. You can train an artist to work in this technique or that technique, maybe to look in a different way, but there's a certain way of looking that somehow it becomes part and parcel of the personality. I really believe that. I never dreamed I would become the first curator of the Hopper collection at the Whitney Museum with the charge to write the catalog raisonné, the complete works of Edward Hopper, and to organize a major exhibition. And when I began that, I discovered that Edward Hopper had worked as an illustrator, doing commercial work and for magazines, and I realized they had had an influence on his development. Researching Hopper as an illustrator was really like looking for needles in a haystack. So a lot of evidence that one would like disappeared, shall we say. I was surprised at how large the body of his illustration work was and how much of his time and energy it took up, and about how much survived in one form or another. Some of it was only available on microfilm at the Library of Congress, which had shredded those magazines. So they're pretty ephemeral. Edward Hopper was not the only, quote, fine artist that had an earlier career in illustration. And illustration was a pretty honorable profession. And today, with so much photographic reproduction on magazine covers, we have less of the art of illustration than we used to have. It was really very important. And for him, it was just a way to earn a living, which he had not chosen as his dedicated path in life, but that his parents had insisted upon. It was they who wanted him to study illustration and not, quote, fine arts, because they wanted him to be able to support himself. A perfectly understandable, if unreasonable, request for someone who, like Edward Hopper, who really had trouble working on under direction. He needed to make art for self-expression and not with someone else's recipe. And he went to the school which had been called the Correspondence School of Illustration. Then he transfers to the New York School of Art, which is prestige-wise a cut above, and they're not only teaching illustration, but they're teaching painting. And I think there he mixed with students who were studying both illustration and painting, and that made it easier to make that leap into studying painting. So among the teachers, Hopper really liked a teacher that came a little bit after he had already started in the school, Robert Henry. I don't think he came till about 1903. And Henry was immensely popular, including with Hopper. But then it was when Henry went on a portrait painting commission that John Sloan, the painter and illustrator, filled in for him. Of course, Sloan was by then known for his painting, and his etchings, which I think had a big influence on Hopper. But he had worked quite a bit as an illustrator, and Hopper admired Sloan. I think there was a brief encounter, but Hopper certainly knew Sloan's work, and I think that could at least justify working in illustration and still being able to become the painter that Hopper wanted to be. The actress Helen Hayes said that Edward Hopper was the grumpiest person she ever met. Such a grouch. He was not a people person. He said, "I hate to draw people grimacing and gesturing. What I really want to paint is sunlight on the side of a house." And Edward was a loner, an introvert, depressive, often had painter's block, couldn't find anything to paint. Hopper himself admitted that he never aspired as high as the Saturday Evening Post, which I think is a direct reference to Rockwell. And it's interesting, too, how someone like Norman Rockwell, who loved being an illustrator, was very comfortable working on commissions, and someone like Edward Hopper, who was miserable having to work on commissions and didn't want to make that kind of work. It's interesting to see how the public does respond in a similar way to their images. The Rockwells have more story, I think, a more obvious story, more anecdote. And I think Rockwell so captures the emotional expression of people in different situations, whereas Hopper is much more interested in the sort of the situation and the internal thoughts. The person doesn't broadcast their emotion as clearly as they do in Rockwell. And Hopper is much more generalized, and you have to imagine quite a bit more about what's the story. You're getting like one frame of a very long film and not a lot of hints. But that's one of the things that I really enjoy about Edward Hopper, is that you can bring your own knowledge and imagination to bear on those images. And sometimes there are clues that I think if you unravel them, you do get a bit of a story. I compare certain of his early illustrations to William Glackens, a member of the Eight and Ashcan School. So Glackens really knew French art, and Edward Hopper really knew French art and loved French art, especially Degas. But if you look at those restaurant images of Hopper and Glackens and then compare it to Hopper's painting from the late 20s, Chop Suey, it's all right there. He's got the composition all worked out. Maybe Chop Suey gets made bolder and more simplified, but it's right there. You can see the germ of it really easily. If we look at a little illustration he did called Basketball, he has the basketball player and a very emphatic shadow. And that comes out, that's around 1912 or so. By the early 20s, when he's doing his most famous print, Night Shadows, he's dealing with the large shadow, and the shadow becomes very important. And it's a lot less bold in its execution. The graphic nature of it's different, but the idea of the man and the big shadow is right there. He's already got that idea. And of course, he's not the first to have that idea, but that's where it occurs earlier in his work. Hopper was commissioned to make quite a number of illustrations for this publication, System Magazine, which is the direct precursor. In other words, it became Business Week magazine. We don't think of Edward Hopper as somebody associated with Business Week, but he later paints a number of office paintings. Maybe the most famous one is Office at Night, but he also painted New York office and Office in a Small City. He's a painter of offices, a very unusual subject. And where does it occur? In those illustrations for System Magazine. So there young Edward Hopper is having to produce illustrations to earn his living, and he uses what he knows about the visual arts and the art that he loves, and that he's even, some of which he's, the artist at least, he's seen their work in Paris. And as he becomes an artist, he still loves that work, and he goes back to it yet again. So he doesn't clean out his mind after he stops becoming an illustrator. He's absolutely the same artist mind. So of course there's a relationship. Now, when he had to illustrate for Scribner's, some really fantastic fiction, maybe things occurring in Africa, there's not a lot of correlation from those to his later art. It was just something too exotic that he was very interested in painting the world around him, and something so far-fetched, something so far-flung, so remote from his own experience. It's just not Hopper. He was no Douanier Rousseau, no Henri Rousseau, who could go to the Jardin des Plantes and imagine he was in the tropics. No, Hopper really wanted to paint the world that he saw around him. Well, by the middle of the 1920s, Hopper's career was pretty much launched. He had a sellout show in 1924 at the Frank Grand Gallery where all of his watercolors on view plus some more sold. So his career was more or less launched, and he didn't have to work on commission anymore. And he stops, his last illustration, I think, appears in Scribner's magazine about 1926, but I think it might have been done a year earlier. And he doesn't have to do it anymore. Well, I've always loved great illustration. And it does come from a different place than great art, in the sense that it's done for a very specific end purpose. But I think illustrators are coming out of a lot of the same place as the artist. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of pigeonholing. And as there is now, a lot of times people don't want to know if you write books, they don't want you to also make art. If you make illustrations, they don't want you also to make paintings or sculptures. But my goodness, look at Leonardo da Vinci. He was a Renaissance man. I think we have to understand that some of those same talents and impulses can do more than one thing. Also, for people struggling to be artists, they ought to realize that someone as famous now as Edward Hopper had to do commercial work that he disliked. And he said, you know, every artist has to do something to make a living until they can support themselves from their art. And he actually made a little card with all the things that he could do. It was kind of a joke, and it included curing the sick and taking care of wounded widows, I think, and carpentry, all kinds of skills. So he had a deep sense of irony about having to earn his living in anything other than making his personal expression as fine art. But I think we've seen that the membrane between the illustration and the art is a little porous.